On Aviation Podcast.
All right, friends, welcome back to another episode of the On Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Orlando Spencer. With me today, as usual, is Daniel and Zioka to discuss with us here today. We're going to talk a little bit more about the aviation. Today, we want to really kind of a broad brush approach, broad brush discussion, if you will, on what's going on in the aviation space itself. All right. So we're going to do a status of aviation in 2023. Guys, you know there's a lot been going on in the aviation space. Okay. A lot been going on. We've written a lot extensively over the past year as to what's happening in the space and talking about some of the things that we're seeing. And so today, what we want to talk about with you guys, I want to share with you is we want to first take a look at a brief overview of what's happening in aviation right now, 2023. A whole bunch of stuff happening in the market, economy, jobs, and all that good stuff. Right? We're going to look at job prospects and job market conditions in the aviation space and probably the wider market as well. We're also going to be talking about business opportunities. We're going to be talking about new technologies. And then we want to wrap up the podcast by looking ahead with relations to the things we just listed out. The economic condition, the jobs, how the industry is operating regarding people and the prospects for individuals and the enthusiasts within the aviation industry, the professionals, legislation, technology, and innovation, and just kind of wrap that up. So that will be your format today for this podcast. We'll dive right into it. Let's give you a quick overview on what's going on here. So first things first is let's talk a little bit about regulations. Now, we've seen a lot of things happening with regards to regulations, right? And I can tell you what our views are regarding regulations. We believe that the least amount of regulations you have in the space and allowing the market to operate, we might find that the market discovers solutions that are a lot more efficient in some cases than what you'd find with a lot of restrictive regulations. Take, for example, the deregulation of 1987. When the airline deregulated, the airlines are still regulated, but it's more on the safety side. Okay? Safety side, licensing, and so on, oversight. However, the aviation space was completely regulated, right? With the cab system and all those things, it was completely regulated. And in that time, what happened was that airfares were very high, right? The barrier to entry was very high in terms of new entrants entering the market, like new airlines, and the airfare was very high. Now, the quality of the service was higher in some regard. You can still get high quality service. What you'd find is that across the board, the quality of service was higher. Like, airline was this prestige thing, but it was so expensive. After deregulation, the prediction was that the thing would fall apart. Prices would fall low, no one would want to fly, and it wouldn't work because if you take away the hub and spoke system and give some of the regional, the low-cost carrier like Southwest, and you had guys like Pacific Southwest over there, over in California. Southwest was in Texas. People thought that all this competition would cause the thing to crumble. In fact, the exact opposite happened. As a matter of fact, an order of magnitude of the opposite happened. The aviation industry, the airlines rather, flourished. Fares fall and prices fall and new entrants enter the market and companies come in, they fall out, they go bankrupt, and that is a free market. The best of the best will survive and provide the most affordable, highest value service. Now, back to the service. What I've said earlier is that back then it was like one blanket service in a sense. The entire thing was just fancy. Now you have fancy, you have the economy, you have super economy, you have all the different things that a lot of people can take can engage with and use the services of the airline at different levels. And that's because of, deregulation. Now, you need some sort of regulation or standards. You need something to manage the aviation space. It's the thing would run amok. Is that going to be the government side? We don't know if it's government, because, for example, take your insurance, for example. Your car insurance is not run by the government, but it runs smoothly. So it's a standard setting or mechanism that runs in the free market that works well there as well. But then it's very difficult to get away from the regulations. But all that to say that there are options out there in terms of regulations. But we've seen in terms of regulations inside the space right now, where I see California doing some stuff with, sustainable aviation fuels, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go forward. And then we also see where Florida is doing some other things there in terms of their aerospace. I think they call it Space Florida or something like that. What the regulations they're putting in place, and the idea is to make these sectors better. Only time will tell. We do know that if you restrict this space with too much regulation, then you may have a problem. So there's a balancing act there. All right. So enough of regulations right now. Danny, what have you been seeing out there in terms of anything you've been seeing in terms of regulations as well in this space?
Yeah, so I've seen quite a lot of new things lately. Just yesterday, I watched a video by an aviator on YouTube speaking about how aircrafts are going to be much cheaper to acquire. That's because there's this kind of new program that allows people to build their own aircraft. It might make it a lot cheaper for students or people who are learning to fly.
I did hear about that one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's gonna make it cheaper for people to afford. However, it does have some certain requirements. You have to be in a certain place of where the airplane is being manufactured. So if you live in a different city, that's an additional cost for you to travel. I think
what you're talking about is building your own experimental aircraft. There's some regulations have been lightened somewhat to allow you to be able to build a little bit more freely with less restriction. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yep.
It's I find it really intriguing.
But my friend, not cutting you off here too much, but when you think about that, that is a level of deregulation, and that is good, because that would bring more players into the space who will then self-correct and self-regulate. Because when you put the profit motive in there, and companies about to lose money talk and everything else walk out the door, right? And so they're going to make sure that they're in good standings to make sure they don't lose that money. And that's one of the biggest things, right? But go ahead.
Right. Yeah. I think it's a really great move. People are going to invest a lot in this experimental program. There's some additional costs will come in between if you live far from where the aircraft is being put together. That's an additional cost for you for you to travel and get there. But still, I think it's a really great way of allowing people to afford aircrafts. And I think that's one of the advantages of having deregulation in aviation space in the U.S.
Right. Meaning you mean the having a lightening up the regulations a little bit.
Yeah. Yes.
There. So one of the things that you notice is that the United States have a lot of regulations in terms of aviation, but it is the least regulated space, aviation, in the world. And that's one of the reasons why we have such a vibrant general aviation space, because it is regulated, but it is the least regulated. For example, in China, there is no general aviation. In many countries, there's no general aviation. It's all run by the government. There's no general aviation where you can go build an aircraft, go fly rent an aircraft. And that's why a third of our pilot training that happens here, in 2019, I believe it was 50,000 new student pilot license A third of that came from overseas, whether they're going for an airline or people just come here to learn to fly. But a third of that come from overseas. They come here to train because the accessibility is a lot better. And because the accessibility is a lot better, there's a lot more trial and error, people figuring it out because more people doing it, more people in the space, and the free market is working. It is the best training ground in the world, right? Because of that freedom. And I think that's a good thing. So thank you for that, Danny. Let's jump on a little bit here in terms of what's going on in the space economic overview, in terms of the economics in the market itself. Now, we've written a lot in our articles, guys. You know this. We've written a lot in our articles about economics and how it affects the aviation space. And you know that, one of the biggest things that's affecting individuals and businesses in the space is really the inflation. And we've been saying this for over a year now. Inflation is a big thing and it's not going to go away. And no matter what the Federal Reserve say and blah, 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 blah. And we've been saying this. Even if inflation comes down a little bit, it will be high for the rest of this decade. And we're putting ourselves on a limb and say that. It's going to be high for the rest of this decade. And what does that mean for the market? It means that prices are going up. And it also means that businesses that don't have a lot of pricing power will have a problem. For example, flight schools and aviation business that don't have a lot of pricing power, right? For example, we know that flight schools and a lot of aviation businesses, it's pretty much feast and famine. These guys and gals run great businesses, really good business. And in fact, flight schools are one of the most efficient businesses given the constraints in the entire country. These guys sometimes make no money for months, and then some months they're making money. It's almost like they're oil riggers or something. And sometimes they're making money, sometimes they're not making any money. And they're working with so much condition. They're working with regulations, they're working with market condition, they're working with the airline mergers, they're working with inflation, they're working with oil prices. So much factors goes into running a flight school. It just seems like, you just go there and jump in a plane and the instructor say, pull the yoke backward and climb, right? It doesn't work like that. In terms of the real business itself, it's quite difficult. And so sometimes we hear all this talk about flight schools. They are the ones that are responsible for the pilot shortage, and it's because they're raising prices and this. In fact, flight school has very little pricing power. We have a client we're working with right now, great folks, and they took a year when the inflation hit high numbers to actually pass on some of that cost to their customer. And even then, they're passing on only some of that cost because they know if they're not able to add value with that cost or price increase, the competition is going to take the clients. And that's how it is. Right. So in a sense, flight training, even though it's so sophisticated, right? It is almost commoditized. And in other podcasts, we'll talk about how we're helping our flight school clients and aviation businesses to get out of the commoditization of their business and deal with real strategy and a competitive advantage, rather. Deal with that competitive advantage, accelerate their own competitive advantage. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the market condition, the wider market condition will affect the aviation space, and that's what's happening now. And we'll see more of that moving forward, right? We'll see more of that. We'll see a lot of challenges with folks like Southwest. Yeah, they have an old scheduling system and all that good stuff, but we see some of those challenges happening with those guys. And, what does that mean? Is it because the market conditions is a particular way they can't invest in a new system, and if they try to invest in a new system, they will take away capital from one segment to another? Will they lose their GOAT status, to use a urban term here, urban phraseology, the greatest of all time status of being the only airline in the entire world to never make a loss on their balance sheet?
I feel like sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I feel like it's more of I think when Southwest started getting these kind of issues, previously they were not getting these kind of issues. If we had delays, it wouldn't take too much of a time. You'd probably be in your destination by the end of the day. But the thing is, the way they had their software set up, even though it was old, but their procedures and booking, they had a point-to-point system, and that turned out to help them save a lot of money, and it also made traveling cheaper for the customers. But the moment it failed, people got the impact of it because I'm not sure if there was any other factor apart from the system that caused the delays more during the holidays, but I think there was a lack of control of the whole matter, and also there was not as many flight attendants or people on the ticketing to handle the issues, and that's actually why they ended up in the situation they were. And I feel like it's unnecessary for them to replace the system. I think they could have handled it a lot better by making sure they had some sort of fallback. So that would mean more employees, but there's a shortage, or more quality control over the situation. But yeah, those are just my thoughts. What do you think, Orlando?
So I was thinking more that, while I agree with some of what you say there, I think the Southwest do not operate on a hub and spoke system. And a hub and spoke system is pretty much what it is. A hub is a bunch of spoke running off. The majors work from that framework where they go from a central place where they're operating on them. Every time they fly out, they come back to that center and go back out, come back to that center. Southwest don't do that. Southwest do a point to point. So if you're flying from A, B, C point and something happened at B, the folks who are going to C and their baggage may have a problem. The challenge is that once you have major hiccups, if you have a lot of hiccups, it's hard for you to compensate. The system they're using may be a little too old. Again, I believe, even though times are changing, that point-to-point system is still a superior system to the hub and spoke system for a low-cost carrier, right? I think I think Ryanair operate that way too. That is a superior system for the business model that they have. What they need to do is to set their processes and their technology in such a way that they can deal with hiccups that are order of magnitude, use that phraseology again, than what they're normally getting. So normally they get like, okay, we have 10 cancellations today, right? What would happen if we have 1,000? And stress test their system for that, and then modify the system to accommodate. But it just works so well, and because costing is a problem these days, because the airlines are, again, feast and famine, and because they're coming out of a pandemic, they're trying to cope with everything. There's a rush of people coming in because people are binge flying because they couldn't go out. A whole bunch of factors. So one of the things that we don't want to do, though, is you and I, we're not going to do. We're not going to criticize Southwest because these guys are the GOAT. They know what they're doing. They've been doing this the very best for decades. Absolutely. Just want to give our insight into what we think. Right, so that's a great point you've made there. Let's talk a little bit about business opportunities. A lot of things are coming on in the space these days regarding business opportunities. Now, we see a couple of things. One, we see these air taxis, and a lot of people are coming into space regarding air taxis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about looking ahead with some of these things. So we see those. People are excited about those. We also see where a lot of electric trainers are coming online. Now, the infrastructure is not really there yet. They can't really fly that far. I think Pipistrel has an electric trainer that is really close to what could be certified by the FAA. But last time I checked, the FAA requires that you need to be able to day VFR, right? Land with a minimum of don't tell me I forgot that already. Land with a minimum of half an hour of fuel, and I think night is 1 hour. And I can't believe I forget that. And I'll double check that with you guys and let you guys know. Comment wherever you're listening to our podcast. And if I have that wrong, I'll definitely correct that. So much going on in my head. So the FAA has that, right? So I think it's half an hour a day VFR reserve. You need to have power reserve, fuel, power, whatever you call it, reserve. When you land, you need to have half an hour in the tank, half an hour battery, whatever it is. I think the last time I checked, Pipistrel can't go full performance with student and everything for more than 25 minutes. So they can't even go for 25 minutes, much less have half an hour reserve. So they're still working on that, right? They've been approved in other places, certain places, but because the regulations on that level is a little bit different. So we see those technologies. So we see the air taxi, we see that the electric trainers, infrastructure is needed at the flight school level to manage those kind of aircraft. Definitely.
Right.
Manage those aircraft, because one of the things that we've been working on is figuring out how to help design ideas to help flight schools manage those kind of equipment. Now, you have the fuel consumption stuff, you have that stuff, but how do you manage the gigawatt hours? How do you manage all those things? How do you plug that into your system whatever you're using at the flight school to manage electronically and your business? So those things are going to be needed, right? Those things are going to be important. So we see those opportunities. We also see where folks are starting flight schools, right? And one of the things that we see in that space is that folks start flight school because folks believe that it's generally instructors or pilots that start flight schools. And we tend to have a thing where we go through flight school, it's tough. We think to ourselves, it can be better. So we come up with an idea and we start a flight school. What flight schools run into in terms of these opportunities is as they start scaling, the components that they used to start cannot scale with them. And it's not because the individual components cannot scale. They do, but they throw out, and in another podcast we can talk a little bit more about that, but they throw out the competitive advantage when they scale. We can talk more about that in the podcast. So we see where flight schools are coming in. We see some new flight schools starting up. Folks start flight school, they're excited about it. They're generally airline pilots or instructors, and then they start getting bogged down and struggling because the nature of the beast is a little bit different. If you talk to anyone that owns a flight school, they'll tell you it's tough. And I don't think I could start a flight school. Having worked with a lot of flight schools, I think that we can provide a lot of great services to flight schools and help them operate. But running a flight school, that's a different animal. It's almost as if you can be a consultant to a Fortune 500 company, but if you were to, as a CEO, run the company, that's a different business. And I hit my hats off to flight school owners because, and the bigger, more than the hats off. If you have multiple locations and running that thing, it's important. It's significant. So we see where the air taxi, we see where some flight schools are starting up and trying out, starting with one aircraft and so on. We see the electric aircraft in the space right now. We also see VTOLs, right? Vertical and takeoff vehicles. They're pretty much drones that people can sit in. They're not the taxis. They're the individual personal stuff as well. So we see those things. I want to talk a little bit now, shift gears a little bit and talk about what's going on with job prospect in the market. Now, for some people, those who are unionized, they may not notice a lot of challenges with the job stuff. You see some unionized pilot, they're pilot and flight crew, and they may be, particularly pilots in the airlines, they're probably protesting a little bit about, probably the mask mandates, vaccination mandates, conditions, and they want certain exchange. But you see those things. Well, you need to pay attention to the non-unionized folks, the folks, the grounds folks, those kind of people. Those people are not unionized. Work with the airline, the airports. Those folks are much more easier to let go in tough times, right? And so those folks are much larger in number because in terms of cost to the airlines and to the aviation business, it's actually the pilots. But in terms of sheer numbers, it's more like the ground crew and those auxiliary folks who help outside of flight crew and stuff that helps the entire operation. And we see some of those things where some of those jobs are becoming more unstable in terms of the security around those jobs. So that starts initially in the tech space because that's where a lot of what we call the malinvestment, we can talk more about that in another podcast, was where the malinvestment, where money was spent in investing in personnel and products and technology and development that would not have been if interest rates weren't so low. We can talk more about that as well. So you see a lot of those things happening, right? And then that leads itself into what's happening with the business opportunities. For business opportunities, we see where people are coming into the space, but we suspect that as we go forward, you may not see as much as that because a lot of this come from investor funding, and investor funding is based on what people are willing to invest in, based on where interest rates are at and all that good stuff, right? Yeah. New technology, whatever the market is doing, new technology is always going to be there. We talk a little bit about the personal VTOLs. We talk about air taxi. We talk about, electric trainers. We also can talk a little bit about SAFs as well, which is sustainable aviation fuels. We put out an article. We're putting out an article. We're gonna put out an article about the whole business of SAFs themselves and the investment. And what we're finding is that the investment may be falling off because of the same factors we talk about, interest rates and all that good stuff, right? So when interest rates are low, people put a lot of money into these things, seeking higher return, taking on more risk. When interest rates are higher, people say, you know what, I'm gonna park my money with the Fed, or park my money with this, or so on. So that's a big part of it. That's a big part of it when you look at it, right? So new technologies, that's a big thing. So let's switch gear a little bit. Before we switch gear, Danny, any thoughts on those things before we switch gear in terms of looking ahead as to what we think is going to be happening in the space?
Yeah, I think a lot of factors that will affect the space is definitely the economic context of it. I think a lot of people sometimes do ignore that part, or they don't think it's a major important part. But aviation jobs are just jobs like any other, and these are things that people should pay attention to. And I'm just going to be looking forward to discuss more about that, especially what's been going on in Silicon Valley. There's been a lot of malinvestments.
Thank you, Danny. So in terms of looking forward, there's a lot going on in terms of economics and market conditions, right? We talked about inflation. We talk about interest rates. When interest rates rise, people don't take on a risk. When interest rates are lower than inflation, so if interest rates are, say, 2% and inflation is 6%, investors know that their real return is negative 4%. They don't want that. So what they do, they take on more risk. They put their money in venture firms. They take on a lot more risk. So you see a lot more businesses get invested in. That's what we call the malinvestment, because it's not natural, because the interest rates were artificially suppressed. And so now that interest rates are rising, people are taking their money out of these more riskier investment and parking their money in places where they can get a good return without taking a massive amount of risk. And then you see where companies are now cash strapped for that kind of funding to fund some of these things. That affects the aviation space. That affects the innovation of the space, just these personal VTOLs, these air taxi. It's going to significantly affect that space, because those space is highly capital intensive. It requires a lot of capital. And so we're going to see some fallback there in those spaces. In terms of flight schools, I don't believe it will affect the small guy or gal just going to the airport and using an aircraft rental or a plane they already had flying around personally to start a small flight school with one plane, one instructor and two instructor, a clerk, and it shouldn't affect much. That should still continue, right? Because that's not dependent on large amount of investor money. So we'll still see that happening, right? And so we'll see those things. Looking ahead at technology and innovation, right? Again, the innovations that are capital intensive will slow down. They will not stop, but they will slow down. They will not stop, particularly if they're being funded by the state or the government or the state. Those will continue. We're talking not just in the United States. We're talking about all over the world. If they're being funded by the U.S. or, say, China funding some innovation, or any country funding their own innovation, you'll find that those will continue. Right? China invests a lot in their aviation space, so some of those things will continue. Right? The free market stuff will be settled out because of malinvestment, and you'll still have some continue there. Right? So that's most important. So we'll still see innovations. We'll still see innovations on the side of cost reduction. Companies and individuals work very hard these days to cut costs, and they're gonna come up with a lot of creative ways to cut costs. Some of the most creative cost-cutting ways in innovation came out of the Great Depression, right? So we'll see some really cool stuff coming out of an economic crisis. No doubt, the world will not stop, right? Certain things, some people will lose jobs, certain business will fail, but the innovations will continue out of necessity. As they say, invention is a matter. I was at the necessity, the mother of all inventions, I guess what they say, right? So we see that, right?
Right.
The next thing we'll see looking forward to is the regulations. If governments around the world believe that the problems in the space, in the aviation space, is as a result of the free market, then they will, and generally they will increase regulation, which will stifle the future a little bit more if those regulations are restrictive. Okay? If they see it as too much regulation and freeing up to be able to free up some of the stuff we talked about earlier, Danny, right? We talked about some of those things. We talked about one with the experimental aircraft.
Right.
If they free up some of those things, you will see the innovation because of that profit motive of individuals and businesses cause that innovation to skyrocket, which will overcome a lot of the major challenges that we've seen. So a lot of that. Danny, I want to hear your thoughts a little bit, though, on the technology innovation side.
Yeah, I feel like there's quite a lot of development on there. I've seen a lot of startups based in aviation have some really great ideas. Lots of my favorite ones are in drones or flying taxis. I feel like there's a lot of possible great things that are coming up, but at the same time, I feel like there's also the expectations of when exactly these things will come into reality, and I'm not really sure what's holding them back, especially for the air taxis. But I think there's a lot to do with regulations, or also when it comes to different states and laws. I think there's quite a lot of things going on there. I think it's similar to what's happening with drones. Some cities you cannot fly drones freely. It's illegal to fly drones in certain spaces. But at the same time, there's a lot of other places that you can fly drones freely. I feel like there's quite a lot going on there, but I'm looking forward to unwrap that part soon. But I've seen a lot of great development on that side.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And regarding the drones, you could be able to fly these drones all you want, but now you have to get a Part 107 drone license. I have one, right? So you can fly these drones for money or commercially. Yep. It's like a commercial drone license. You can fly with drone, but there are certain limits that I think you can fly up to 100 feet, I believe, in certain areas, and then you can't fly next to airports. So there are some space that you can actually fly your drone, but for the most part, you would need to get a Part 107 license from the FAA to do that. It's almost like getting a pilot license. If you don't have a pilot license, actually, you're going through a pilot license program. My advice is go get a pilot license, go fly real planes. But again, a lot of folks enjoy drones and stuff. So let me not say don't do that. Go do what you do. Enjoy that stuff. It is very fun, and you can earn a lot, because I know people who make over $200 an hour, taking photography and landscaping and photography and all these things as well. So a lot of stuff can be done with drones. So let's just wrap up this podcast here with the prospect for individuals and individual enthusiasts and professionals in the space, right? We talk a lot about businesses, but that always affect the individual. And we talk a lot about the business themselves in terms of the inflation. Now, how inflation is measured for business is the producer's prices. It's like business inflation is that what it costs producers to purchase the things that goes into the goods and services that they sell to the customers.
Right.
So from a consumer perspective, what you'll find is that the more costs are rising for companies, as the economists would say, all things being equal, ceteris paribus, the more you'll see prices rise for the consumer side. What was happening in 2020 when 2021 when inflation was rising, the businesses were absorbing the inflation cost, their increased costs, and not passing it off because they were afraid that they would lose their customer. And they also believed that inflation was transitory, because the Federal Reserve said inflation was transitory. We've been saying that the thing is not transitory at all. It is real. It's going to be here for a long time, and we were proven right on that. It's been here, a couple of years already, and it's going to be here quite longer. And now they're passing those costs off to consumers. And to the point where they cannot pass those costs off anymore, they pretty much just go out of business. Right. And so that affects customers' ability to get the goods and services at the price and at the availability, because some business may be going out of business. That also affect the job prospect for the professionals, for the employees. Where you're going to work if the business is shutting down? Where you're going to work if the business is trying to cut costs? The company will always they will generally try to cut employee, because the employee represents one of the largest costs on the and wages are prices. And that's one thing that people need to understand. Wages are prices. It's prices for the services of labor and our knowledge. It is a price. And so when they're looking to cut prices, the cost for the business, when they're looking to cut costs, they do that there as well. But they let go people or reduce hours or so on. For the enthusiasts themselves, it doesn't really affect much because the enthusiasts don't really get paid in the space, right? So once the things are happening, the enthusiasts are fine. There maybe not be a lot of as much as before, but they still get to do those things. The professionals are generally unionized, especially if they work for the aviation, work for airlines and so on. Generally unionized. Consultants, not so much because consultants, probably lawyers again, right? So those maybe drift down a little bit. So we see where throughout the space and moving forward, there'll be a lot of different moving pieces. We can't say when, we can't say where, but we can tell you that how it's going to happen because of the different factors that we're seeing. We can talk about this some more in other podcasts as we go forward. But in this podcast, we really wanted to kind of just give a broad overview of what's happening and then dive into what we think the future looked like. And then as we move forward with the podcast, in other episodes, we'll be able to dive in further details into some of these things and give you greater insights along with the articles, because rest assured, the articles continue. Okay, our On Aviation bites continue, our posts continue. We're not going to stop those things. So we're going to give you what we've got and let you guys be able to have that kind of knowledge. Daniel, any thought before we head on out?
I think this is a really great chance to get to dive into the first few things. So I'm hoping to hear back from our audience to see what their thoughts are on the aviation space right now and the economy, how it's affecting aviation jobs. What do you think about these new technologies or what the new regulations are doing for aviation? And what do you think about these aircrafts, where these experimental aircrafts? Do you think it's going to do good for you if you're a student or if you're a pilot, and if you enjoy these kind of things?
All right. Thank you, Danny. And as always, guys, we appreciate you so much for reading our articles, engaging with our content, and for listening to this podcast. As usual, you can get this podcast wherever you listen to your podcast, on all podcast platforms. All right. And again, reach out to us. We look forward to your feedback as we learn and grow in this whole business of doing a podcast. Thank you for listening, guys, and see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye now.
Bye.